So I get questions about EB-1A authorship all the time, specifically what kinds of authorship to look into. Here are 3 types of authorship to look into, and a general overview of the pros and cons of each type of authorship. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jason, and I work with several top immigration lawyers, which is where my profile building insights for EB-1A come from. I also run a newsletter where I share newsletter resources for those of you who are building towards EB-1A, O1, and EB-2NIW. Within the paid component of my newsletter, you will get access to my profile building opportunities database, some of my other resources, as well as my private group, where people have been able to find collaborators for authorship opportunities, have been able to find speaking opportunities through other members, as well as other kinds of opportunities to help build their EB-1A profile. If you're interested in those kinds of resources, feel free to check out the link in the comments. But going back to the video, here are 3 types of authorship to look into for EB-1A. The first type of authorship is journal articles. So everyone loves to talk about journal articles, and generally speaking, I would say that they do tend to be a very strong form of authorship, but we will go into the pros and cons for this type of authorship and why it might not make sense for you to go for journal articles. But generally speaking, journal articles do tend to be the strongest form of authorship. The second type of authorship is technical publications. These are technical magazines, so you'll see a lot of these with organizations like IEEE and ACM. You'll see a lot of these magazines that have industry professionals publishing in them. The standards for these magazines tend to be lower than those of top conferences and journal articles, and they can still be great examples of authorship for the authorship criterion. Third example, professional publications. Now, this sounds like a very generic term because it is. So we're talking industry publications, trade publications, anything that professionals in your field would usually read. These would fall under professional publications. And the editorial standards may still be high, it's just that they're going to be vastly different to publishing in, say, a technical magazine. So these are the types of authorship that are most common for the authorship criterion, based on what I've seen. Now let's go into journal articles first. Journal articles. Now, the question I get all the time is, should I be publishing in a journal? And the answer is, if you have the time, if you have the right collaborators, publishing in journals can be a great way to meet the EB-1A authorship criterion, especially if you are getting to publish in a high quality journal. So going into the pros and cons of publishing in journals, I would say the first pro is if you get into a high quality journal, if you get to publish in a high quality journal, you can use that publication as an indicator that you're risen to the top of your field. And that is why your research is getting published. You can reinforce the argument that you have a high level of expertise in your field, and that's why you're getting recognized by other top professionals in your field by being able to publish in a top journal, something that is not open to just anyone. And I haven't really seen this with journals yet, but I have seen a lot more conferences include industry tracks, and within these industry tracks, sometimes the articles that get published with these conferences do get picked up by the journals that are attached to the conference. So that is one way to get published through a top journal, and it can help reinforce the argument that you have a high level of expertise in your field. The other advantage with journals, especially if they're attached to top conferences in your field, is that you can find peer review opportunities through them. A lot of journals tend to draw the reviewers from the people who got published. So that can be another advantage to publishing a journal article. Now, given these two pros, there are cons to publishing in a journal. Firstly, it takes a long time to get published in a journal. And I'm not talking about taking a long time to get published. It takes a long time to even put together the submission, which could get rejected. So you could spend 6 months to a year putting together a journal article only for it to get rejected by the journal that you were targeting. So that's just something to keep in mind when it comes to journal articles. Of course, you can always recycle the material and use it for other publications, but the point still stands that it just takes a long time to put together a journal article, and there are just lots of conventions that you have to follow for an effective journal article. Second thing is you kind of need collaborators. I mean, you can always write an entire journal article on your own, but if you are working, say, at a very intense industry job and you need to, and you're trying to put together a journal article at the same time, then you will most likely need collaborators. So that is going to be an additional element to publishing a journal article, coordinating the work with a bunch of other people who could also be extremely occupied with their jobs. That's just something you're going to have to keep in mind when working on a journal article, that you will most likely need collaborators. I would say the third con is that there are just a lot of unknown unknowns when it comes to journals. Keep in mind that when you're publishing in a journal, you will probably be considered alongside researchers in your field. So as an industry professional, you may not have that novel of research contributions to share. It just comes down to the kind of industry experience and to the kind of journal you're targeting. But that's just something to keep in mind. You will be compared alongside other people who have published a lot of research and are just in academia in general and are just more familiar with publishing journal articles. So that's for journal articles. But overall, I would say that publishing in a journal is still fine. It's still something to potentially look into, especially if you have collaborators, especially if you know how to publish in journals, especially if you're interested in publishing in journals. It's just something that can take a lot of time and will most likely just take a lot of effort and a lot of manpower. The second form of authorship is actually commonly overlooked: technical publications. So as I said, we are talking IEEE magazines or ACM magazines as examples. And I'm sure there are other examples out there, but these are the most common ones that I've come across. The pros for these are less stringent with editorial standards. It's just more difficult to get published in a journal, whereas it might be less difficult, comparatively speaking, to get published in an IEEE magazine or an ACM magazine. The editorial standards are far less stringent, and there are just far fewer conventions you have to follow, which means that you just will overall spend probably less time per submission and still get some good authorship out of the opportunity. Second pro is that they tend to be open to industry professionals. A lot of them actually want practitioners to submit articles. So you have that to play with. You have that overall interest in work from industry professionals. Whereas with a lot of journals, a lot of conferences, it really depends on the type of journal and the type of conference. Some of them just won't like industry submissions. Some are just so heavily biased towards research that you're just not going to get through to them. But with publications, technical publications like IEEE magazines and ACM magazines, I have seen more industry professionals actually get published in these publications. Now, a significant con is, I wouldn't say it's a significant con, but you could just say that comparatively speaking, getting published in a magazine is just not as impressive as getting published in a top journal in your field. Now, it's not really a con, but it's really the only one I can think of. Publications in general, like technical publications, are just not going to be as prestigious as, say, getting published in a top research conference or getting published in a top journal. That's just something to keep in mind. And if you really, really are concerned about authorship, try to go for journal articles and don't just focus on technical publications. But I think that's the only con you have to think about when it comes to technical publications. I think technical publications are a great example of authorship. They're the middle ground you want to go for when it comes to authorship, at least for most professionals. I'm not saying all professionals, but most industry professionals should probably look at technical publications. Let's go move on to professional publications. Now, some of these publications look like blogs. They might not be blogs, but they look like blogs. So that is actually a line of questioning that could come about if you focus just on professional publications, because a lot of professional publications do look like blogs. But that's just something we're going to explore. But first, let's look at the pros. Far less stringent. I would say it depends on a professional publication, but generally speaking, from what I've seen, the editorial standards tend to vary across publications, but the overall are definitely lower than the editorial standards of journals. But of course, it depends on the professional publication, it depends on the journal, but generally speaking, the editorial standards are lower, as in not as strict. They're also more open to industry professionals, as in they're pretty much expecting industry professionals to publish in them. So for software engineering, we're talking lead dev towards data science. These kinds of publications are always looking for industry submissions as well as research submissions as well. And they take less time to work on these kinds of articles, far fewer conventions, far fewer strict editorial standards, and the review time tends to be far shorter than the review times for, say, a journal or for a research conference. The cons are, if something looks like a blog, it is going to get questioned. It doesn't matter if it's actually a blog. USCIS seems to have this bias for academia. They seem to like academic research over professional publications. So if something looks like a blog, it's going to possibly get questioned. The second thing with professional publications is that they may just be extremely popular amongst industry professionals. So in a sense, they could be more difficult to get into, but it really depends on the industry publication you're targeting. But really, the primary con when it comes to industry publications is that they can potentially look like blogs. The one other just like really small con to think about is that you may not be able to show as much prestige with these publications, but again, it depends on the industry publication. But in the mind of USCIS, where it seems like there's this heavy positive bias for academia, you may not be able to convey the prestigiousness of a publication over, say, the prestigiousness of a research conference that has gotten a lot of involvement from top universities, is heavily cited often, has a long history of research contributions, versus an industry publication that could still be well known, could still be considered as prestigious, but just may not be considered as prestigious as a top research conference. But it's a minor con. I think the only con you have to think about is the blog element of things. If an industry publication looks like a blog, it is probably going to get questioned. So those are just 3 examples of authorship to look into. I would say that the most accessible form of authorship is probably going to be technical publications. It's going to be technical magazines, IEEE magazines, ACM magazines, and there are other magazines out there. There are quite a few you can target within IEEE and ACM already. So look into those kinds of publications. They are the middle ground that you want to look into, and they will involve a mixture of research as well as industry contributions as well. And it's going to be the more accessible form of authorship versus getting published in a journal, and is probably not going to get questioned as much as, say, articles in professional publications. But again, it depends on the professional publication. But generally speaking, if a professional publication looks like a blog, it is most likely going to get questioned. Just something to keep in mind for professional publications.